This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you are watching is something quieter and far more dangerous. A system that learned how to tolerate fiction, a system that priced fantasy as fact, a system that kept moving because everyone inside it was still getting paid. For a long time, this looked stable. It looked powerful. It looked permanent until suddenly it wasn't. Today is not about a building. It's not about a courtroom. It's about the moment when enforcement replaces trust. When institutions stop pretending, when the math no longer bends. If you think this story is about punishment, you'll miss it. If you think it's about politics, you'll misunderstand it. This is about how control actually works when credibility collapses. Stay with me. Because once this mechanism reveals itself, it doesn't stop where you expect it to. And it doesn't stop with one name. You think power lives in offices, in elections, in personalities. It doesn't. Power lives in balance sheets, in assumptions that are never audited, in numbers that are treated as polite suggestions instead of reality. For years, this system was not controlled by voters or laws. It was controlled by lenders who looked away, by accountants who normalized distortion, by institutions that learned one rule above all others. As long as the check's clear, do not ask why. This is how control quietly shifted, not through corruption in the open, but through cooperation in private. When valuation becomes narrative instead of measurement, the system stops enforcing truth. It starts enforcing momentum. And momentum is ruthless. It rewards whoever expands fastest. It punishes whoever questions first. That's how fiction scales. That's how risk concentrates. That's how an entire structure can look solid while hollowing out from the inside. What matters now is not who benefited. It's why no one stopped it sooner. Because the next phase begins when silence is no longer profitable. And when that happens, the correction is never gentle. There was a time when numbers had friction. They resisted exaggeration. They pushed back. Before, value was constrained by proof, by income, by demand, by limits. Now, value is negotiated, messaged, deferred, explained away. This didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly enough to feel normal. A small adjustment here, an optimistic projection there, a valuation that assumes tomorrow will fix today. Over time, the exception became the model. Risk stopped being something you reduced. It became something you distributed. And because the consequences were delayed, the behavior was rewarded. Loans were approved, fees were collected, reputations were maintained, no alarms sounded because no one wanted them to. The system learned how to function on faith instead of verification. That's the silent shift. Not corruption as an act, but distortion as a habit. And habits don't look dangerous until the moment they break. Because when reality finally reasserts itself, it doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It recalculates. And the first recalculation is never the last. What happened next looked sudden, but it wasn't. At 2:47 inches the afternoon, a federal judge signed an order that did not argue. It did not warn. It did not negotiate. It transferred control. A property that had functioned as a command center, political, financial, symbolic, was no longer governed by its owner. Operations moved to a court-appointed receiver. Access became conditional. Events were canceled mid-planning. Federal marshals arrived not for spectacle, but for logistics. This wasn't punishment. It was containment. The filing was precise. Numbers, dates, documents, a valuation presented as astronomical when loans were requested. The same asset described as modest when taxes were due. Not a mistake. A pattern. And here's the part that matters. This action didn't come from outrage. It came from arithmetic finally being enforced. If this feels shocking, pause. Ask why it took this long. Ask who benefited from the delay. Because this seizure isn't the story. It's the symptom. And symptoms mean the system is already much sicker than it looks. What happens next depends on something far more uncomfortable. Here's the part most people never see. This system doesn't collapse because of one lie. It survives because lies are absorbed. Banks don't need truth. They need plausibility. They need just enough confidence to justify the fee. So the mechanism works like this. Inflated numbers create larger loans. Larger loans create larger commissions. Risk is sliced, sold, syndicated, and scattered until no single institution feels responsible for the whole. The benefit is immediate. The damage is deferred. Executives sign off knowing the math is aggressive. Internal emails acknowledge the fantasy, but the structure protects them because everyone involved can say the same thing. This wasn't just us. That's how accountability dissolves. Not through conspiracy, through alignment. When deception becomes profitable, enforcement becomes optional. Until suddenly, it isn't. Because eventually, someone has to hold the paper when the story collapses. Someone has to explain why the numbers never matched reality. And when that moment arrives, the system does something drastic. It stops negotiating with narrative. It starts enforcing with force, which is why what you're watching now feels so abrupt. But it's not abrupt at all. It's overdue. Then the pace changes. Fast, assets freeze, accounts tighten, partners go quiet, phones stop ringing back. Institutions that once competed to participate suddenly compete to distance themselves. Statements become careful. Language becomes conditional. This is what acceleration looks like. Not chaos, compression. Multiple investigations converge. Civil exposure brushes against criminal risk. Cooperation spreads because isolation is more dangerous than disclosure. What had been tolerated as aggressive is now labeled documented. What had been framed as optimism is reframed as intent. And notice this. No one rushes to defend the numbers. They defend procedures, process, distance. Because once enforcement begins, the story is no longer about belief. It's about survival. Support evaporates first where the risk is highest, then where the optics are worst, then everywhere else. Momentum reverses, and reversal is unforgiving. This is the point where systems stop protecting individuals and start protecting themselves, which raises the most uncomfortable question yet. Who absorbs the damage when the structure pulls inward? This is where it reaches you. Not symbolically, structurally, because when systems correct this way, they don't land softly on the people at the top. They transfer pressure downward. You feel it as tighter credit, as smaller margins, as rules that suddenly matter after years of flexibility. You're told the market is being responsible again. That risk is being reassessed. That standards are returning. But those standards were always there. They were just selectively enforced. If you've ever wondered why it's harder now to get approved, why rates jump faster than wages, why small mistakes cost more than they used to, this is why. Because when trust collapses at the top, compliance is imposed at the bottom. And here's the quiet part. You didn't cause this distortion, but you're expected to absorb the correction. Stay with me. Because what's happening isn't about fairness. It's about insulation. And the people with the least insulation always feel it first. If this feels familiar, pay attention. The pattern isn't finished unfolding yet. Zoom out. This doesn't stop at one market or one country, because the mechanism that allowed this to grow is not unique. It's replicated. Global finance watches enforcement the way predators watch movement, quietly, carefully. When one system finally clamps down, others adjust. Capital shifts. Risk migrates. Standards tighten in one place and loosen somewhere else. You can see it in how money moves overnight, in how deals reroute through friendlier jurisdictions, in how instability travels faster than regulation. This is the ripple, not panic. Repositioning, and the signal being sent is subtle but unmistakable. Narrative-driven valuation is no longer guaranteed safe, at least not everywhere. at least not forever. So international lenders reassess, sovereign funds recalculate exposure, political systems feel pressure they didn't create but can't avoid, because once enforcement becomes visible, trust doesn't evaporate locally. It reprices globally, and that repricing introduces uncertainty, not collapse, but hesitation. And hesitation in interconnected systems is destabilizing, which brings us to the future phase. Not what will happen, but what could. From here, there are only three directions this can go, not outcomes. Trajectories. The first is adjustment. Quiet, technical, rules tighten, valuations harden, enforcement becomes routine instead of exceptional. The system absorbs the shock, learns just enough, and keeps moving slower, more cautious, still functional. The second is erosion, more familiar, selective enforcement, public action, private accommodation, the appearance of accountability without its consistency. Trust thins, compliance becomes cosmetic. People learn where the lines are flexible again. And then there is rupture. That's when enforcement doesn't just correct behavior. It exposes how much of the structure depended on disbelief. How many valuations were narrative? How many safeguards were performative? Rupture isn't loud at first. It shows up as frozen decisions, as deals that don't close, as institutions waiting for someone else to move first. And waiting is dangerous because systems built on momentum don't survive hesitation for long. Which path emerges depends on what happens next. Not in courtrooms, but in boardrooms, and that decision is already being weighed. This is where I stop telling you what happened and start warning you about what hasn't. Because systems like this don't announce their breaking points, they normalize right up until they can't. What you're watching is not closure, it's exposure. Exposure of how long credibility can be suspended, of how many institutions were willing to confuse confidence with truth, of how enforcement only arrives when instability becomes contagious. And once that line is crossed, it never fully goes back. The danger isn't whether one figure survives this. The danger is whether the system learns the wrong lesson, whether it treats this as an anomaly instead of a diagnosis. If that happens, the next correction will be larger, sharper, less containable. So don't look away now. This is the part people always miss. After the headlines, after the spectacle, when the incentives quietly reset. Because the next story won't arrive as a scandal. It will arrive as math. And when it does, you'll want to remember this moment. When enforcement replaced trust and everyone pretended it was temporary, it never is. Stay with me. There's more coming.